Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, One Tool to Crush the Complexity of MS SQL Availability Group Management. Thank you to everyone for attending. My name is Lauren, and I will be your moderator today. Before we hear from Connor, I want to go over a few housekeeping items with you. All attendees will be muted throughout the entire presentation, but feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A pane on your screen. Connor will answer as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. So with all of that taken care of, let's get started. Here's your host for today, Connor Cox.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you to everyone for joining our webinar today. And today we are going to be covering a new approach to making your availability groups highly available. So in terms of an agenda, just go through kind of a quick intro, a couple of slides, and then we'll jump into a live demo. And as Lauren said, leave plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. And we're keeping it all under 45 minutes today. So before we kind of jump in, I want to launch a poll here just to get an understanding of if any of you folks out there have worked with availability groups or FCIs for your SQL Server environment. So if you wouldn't mind taking a second to respond to the poll. Looks like we've got some responses coming in already. I'll just leave that open for a few more seconds. If you want to go ahead and vote, that would be great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and show the results. So it looks like most of you in the room have used AGs, have some experience with them, and then there are some folks that haven't used AGs or FCIs. So pretty interesting results there. So since most of you already know this, I'm just going to do a pretty quick overview of availability groups just to get everybody on the same page here. Availability groups by themselves are a replication and read scale solution for Microsoft SQL Server. It essentially allows you to create multiple copies of your databases, either synchronous or asynchronous. And it was kind of released as the replacement to database mirroring. So you can think of it as kind of database mirroring on steroids. One bummer is that it carries an Enterprise Edition requirement. Except for SQL Server 2016 or newer, Standard Edition can do a single database availability group, which don't ask me how that is considered a group, but nonetheless, Microsoft has allowed that on Enterprise Edition. So another poll I'm going to launch here. I'm interested in learning what you're running SQL Server on today in terms of platform. So are you doing so on Windows, on Linux, or both? And so as you're looking at this, I'm curious as well in terms of SQL Server running today or what you plan on doing within the next year or so. So if you've got plans maybe to incorporate one platform or the other, please go ahead and respond accordingly. Leave that open for a few more seconds. Looks like most of you have voted already. All right. So everybody in the room is running SQL Server on Windows, and there are a few that are either running on Linux or plan to do so within the next year. So this kind of jives with what I've been seeing. More and more folks are starting to consider SQL on Linux, especially as support for that has been around now for a couple of years. So appreciate your feedback on that. All right, moving on with availability groups. So despite what the name may suggest, availability groups by themselves are not an automated high availability solution. So you need a cluster underneath your AGs to protect them from application, operating system, and infrastructure faults. So this, in fact, gives the availability group automatic failover of various different groups of databases and essentially does that fault detection and the failover automation. So on Linux, Pacemaker is one clustering solution that gets mentioned, gets written about. So that is an open source technology that many SQL and Linux users are using or attempting to use. And then for Windows, of course, you have Windows Server failover clustering. So I'd like to launch another poll here just to understand your experiences with clustering. Have you worked with Pacemaker or WSFC? Both, neither? Just kind of curious what you folks have some experience with in terms of clustering solutions. And of course, Windows here, I'm referring to Windows Server failover clustering. All right, appreciate your feedback on that. Go ahead and share the results there. Most of you, unsurprisingly, have experience with WSFC, and there's about a quarter of you who have not had any experience with any clustering. All right, so let's move on here. Setting up Windows Server failover clustering, and especially Pacemaker, can be quite painful. And as this short video suggests, it can cause you to want to go full office space on your hardware sometimes, and it can be a pain. So let's talk about why, some of the reasons why that it is so painful. So the first one here, you cannot set up a high availability cluster between Windows and Linux because they are two different clustering tools. So some folks out there, they want to do this for migrations or even ongoing, maybe have some secondaries on Linux and their primaries on Windows, can't do it. So that can be a source of frustration for folks. If you are doing both Windows and Linux, you now have to maintain two different high availability clustering solutions. So maybe you've got some AGs on Windows, some on Linux, or you plan to in the future. There's no support for that, again, because you've got these two different solutions to manage. They can be pretty painful to install and configure. Those of you who have clustering experience, you probably already know that, but there's just a variety of configuration considerations as you're setting these up that could be a little bit of a pain. When it comes to support, many vendors that support these are so slow that by the time they get back to you, you've already figured it out yourself. Or once you get in touch with somebody, you kind of tend to start at a pretty low quality support tier, and so that can be a little bit of frustrating for a lot of folks that I speak with about clustering. Let's see here, the networking. So in terms of connecting your availability groups across different sites, maybe you want to do multi-subnet, maybe you want to involve some cloud nodes. There's a lot of networking complexity involved here. So you have to fuss with things like VPNs, exposing ports to the world, and those can also cause security challenges. All the nodes have to be the same for clustering, which can be a bit of an onerous requirement for many folks. And then the rest of these on this list are related specifically to Pacemaker. So those of you that are using Linux or thinking about it, these are some challenges around Pacemaker specifically. And the first is, one that I think is particularly ridiculous, is that there is no cloud production support for Pacemaker. And there's also no production support for Pacemaker on Hyper-V. So if you're thinking about running a production cluster, these are some serious limitations here with Pacemaker. And just a couple more here about the setup and the overall architecture. The setup is all very manual, so you've got a lot of manual steps that you have to maintain, and the architecture itself is pretty brittle, and there are a lot of kind of esoteric requirements here You need to have things like Stoneith devices, etc. So that's why people are getting kind of frustrated. And so what I want to introduce to you folks is a solution called DxAG, which is the DH2I solution for availability groups and making them highly available. So this leverages SQL Server availability groups like you're used to, like a lot of you are used to, but it makes them highly available without the requirement of Windows Server failover clustering or pacemaker. It is far easier clustering to set up. It's easier to manage than those other two solutions mentioned, and it's also easier to provision your availability groups on either platform. So, again, there are some manual steps to setting up an AG without this tool. This just makes things really easy. There's a nice kind of friendly UI to be able to manage them all and set these up. It runs on both Windows and Linux, as mentioned, and it supports SQL Server 2017 as well as SQL Server 2019, which is in RC and going to be out soon. Very unique capabilities here in that this solution can do automated fault detection and failover across both Windows and Linux. So in other words, you can create a highly available cluster using both Windows and Linux nodes. So very unique capability there, and it just kind of speaks to the flexibility of the tool. Another innovation that we've added to this is that DxAG can automatically create secure tunnels for your availability cluster communication, as well as the replication for the availability group, and do so in a way that does not require a VPN, doesn't require any open ports or other networking headaches, complexities, and potential vulnerabilities. So this is just, again, simplifying a lot of the complexity related to spinning up and managing and maintaining these AGs by kind of hiding the complexity of the networking component. All right, so let's get to a demo. What we're going to do in this demo here is take a look at a 3-node cluster that I have already created. And it consists of a Windows Server OS, Windows Server node, that's running on premises in our Oregon data center. And it is connected to and joined to a Windows Server OS, another Windows Server OS that happens to be running in AWS, and then a third node that's a Linux node running Red Hat in Azure. So very unconventional cluster, and I joined them all together using our secure tunneling technology, allowing them to join without the use of a VPN, without the use of a direct link, or any of those other types of complexities, no open ports whatsoever. And then I'm going to add an availability group. So to show you what that process is like to create that availability group across those 3 nodes. And then we'll show kind of how to manage the databases associated with that availability group. So with that, I'm going to connect to our Windows server that is in Oregon, OR Win2, and I've pulled up the UI, the management UI for this product, this clustering product, okay? So you can see here that we have our 3 cluster nodes, AWS Win2, OR Win2, which is our on-prem Windows machine. They both are running Windows Server 2016. And then our RHEL 1 node, which resides in Azure, and as you'll see is running RHEL 7.7. Okay, so very unconventional cluster there, but it really doesn't matter, right? So these could be all Windows, they could be, even in the same network if you wanted them to be, they could be all Linux for that matter. It's completely up to you, but in this case, we've mixed different clouds on premises and different platforms, both Windows and Linux. So in order to create our availability group, we're just going to right click on this vhost So this vhost is essentially the entity under which we associate our availability group. And wherever this vhost is active, the active node will be the primary replica, and the others will be the secondaries. So you can see I've added the OR-Win2, AWS Win2, and RHEL1 in that order. So the OR-Win2 node is going to be the primary once we create our availability group. So we'll go ahead and click Add Availability Group, give our availability group a name. We're going to check this tunnel box, which is going to, again, create those secure tunnels on our behalf for this availability group. And then we need to authenticate to the instances on these nodes in order to set this up. So I am going to be creating an AG on SQL Server 2019. So I just need to authenticate to these instances. All right. Okay, so we're going to reuse that existing endpoint there. And this is our first secondary replica, SQL 2019, authenticate to it. Okay, same thing. And then finally our Red Hat instance. Oops, need to select the instance there. And hit submit. Okay. So we've got our three node availability group here. And once I hit OK, you will see all the settings for this availability group that I am about to create. So am I sure I want to do that? Go ahead and click yes. And now it's creating this availability group for us. Maximize this. So I can click on the availability group, and as that's being created, you'll see that this connected state will update here momentarily. And there you go. Okay, so I just made an availability group across 3 different sites. No VPN, no open ports whatsoever, and across Windows and Linux. And it's really just that easy. Okay, so you now have the option to be able to manage the databases associated with this availability group. So in this case, I can just go in here and let's say I want DB5 to now be part of this availability group. I could select more if I wanted to, right? As many of those databases as I wanted to be part of that availability group, and then just hit submit. And so it's going to go through that process of adding that database, and then of course replicating it out to my secondaries. And we'll give that a few seconds here to synchronize across. Okay, so one of them is synchronized. Okay, and you can see now that all 3 of those replicas are all fully synchronized and healthy. Our primary is on the OR-Win2 machine. Okay, so it's really that simple. I can add, remove databases as I need to, and now this availability group and these associated databases are being managed for high availability. So obviously, if something were to happen to my OR-Win2 machine, this tool would automatically take action and promote the next node in the list, in this case AWS Win2, to primary, okay? And it would do all of that automatically. And of course, I can manually initiate such a failover by just simply saying start hosting on node. So let's say I want to make AWS Win2 now the primary. I can just click on AWS Win2 and say start hosting on node. Okay. And it's not just for if something happens to a node. So if SQL Server, will go down or those services were to stop, this would also automatically take action on our behalf. Okay. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple to set up. And that is what DxAG is all about. So I'm going to hop back to a couple of slides here, just kind of wrap things up a little bit, and we will get some questions. So I wanted to revisit this slide, just kind of remind ourselves, what these frustrations are that people are facing, and then walk through how DxAG differs. So number one, we can make highly available availability groups across both Windows and Linux. Creates a single high availability tool for all platforms. So maybe you don't want a cluster that necessarily spans Windows and Linux. Well, with this, you could have separate clusters, but use the same tool to manage those separate clusters. Very easy to create the cluster as well as create your availability groups. And what I had done before in terms of installing and joining those nodes into a cluster, that process took me, I don't know, a handful of minutes before this session, right? So it's not something that is particularly difficult or lengthy, but I just skipped it in the interest of time. But it's very easy to create the cluster as well. This one's a big deal. We have, as part of this, so once you become a DH2I customer and have a valid support contract, we have 24/7 support, and it's very high quality support. Okay, so we have major banks, governments, those types of things that are leveraging our products, and we are always available to help should something go wrong. So you're not going to run into those issues where you're speaking with somebody, it takes a long time to get back to you, and they're may not be as helpful as you had hoped. The networking component. Okay, so as you saw, we can create multi-subnet availability groups, built-in secure networking, and without the requirement of a VPN or a direct link. This is a really big deal for the cloud. Number one, setting up VPNs in the cloud is kind of painful and just a little bit challenging, and additionally can be very expensive. So the various cloud vendors will charge you, per hour every time you've got that VPN link up. Whereas with this, you can kind of circumvent some of those requirements. No need for like. Okay, so you can do mixed operating systems. You can even do different Linux flavors. So I just showed you one that happened to be Red Hat, but we can also do this on Red Hat derivatives like CentOS, as well as with Ubuntu 16 or 18. So that gives you a lot of flexibility, and they can be all mixed together. Could be some physical bare metal machines. You could run this on some virtualization machines, as well as in the cloud. Again, full production support in the cloud, as well as Hyper-V, any hypervisor support. So in contrast to the major deficiencies in Pacemaker, we can actually support those environments in production that you may want to deploy on. No Stoneth devices in this case for those Linux folks out there. And there are a variety of ways to control this clustering, to set it up. You can certainly use the CLI if you're more comfortable there, you prefer to, or if you'd like to use PowerShell to script things out, you certainly can as well. But we've got that UI that you saw that just makes things a little bit nicer for adding things, removing them, manually failing them over. it just makes life a lot easier when you've got a UI. You can kind of do some management and monitoring of where things are at from that view. And then we also take care of auto creating and propagating the various availability group requirements, things like endpoints and certificates. Those can be a bit of a challenge to juggle when you're setting up a cluster on Linux, but we do all of that automatically on your behalf, and just makes your life a little bit easier when you're trying to bring HA to SQL and Linux. So you might be out there wondering, what does this thing cost? So I want to walk you through it. It's what most people perceive as not that expensive. We've got a couple different licensing models. One is that it's kind of your traditional perpetual license plus support, $1,000 a server for the cores, whether that's physical or virtual, we make no distinction. And then $240 per server per year for support. Okay, so not too bad. And then we've also got a subscription option, $600 per server per year, and that is inclusive of support. Okay, so that's really all that you would need to pay for this this clustering solution. Also want to point out, availability groups does not solve everything. So you may want some instance level high availability in addition to, or even perhaps instead of, availability groups. So, for a number of different reasons, you may be considering that. Cost could be a major one, right? Manageability, maybe you prefer to manage things at the instance level versus at the database level. And so we also recognize that, and we have a solution that has support for managing instances for high availability and disaster recovery. And so this takes advantage of shared and or replicated disks, supports Windows and Linux, no pacemaker, no WSFC, super easy to set up, again, compared to either of those clustering solutions, and can result in some substantial savings for a lot of our customers. So there are a variety of reasons why customers are able to save some money on this. And essentially, the way that we do this is, think about this tool as Windows Server failover clustering without all of the rules. So we are actually managing high availability for standalone instances rather than for clustered instances. But it is very FCI-like. But this allows you to create as many cluster nodes as you want on any edition and avoid a lot of those licensing, additional licensing traps. And then in addition to that, customers are consolidating. They typically run 8 to 15 SQL Server instances per server. Just means fewer cores to have to manage, fewer cores to have to license. And customers can actually mix operating systems and SQL Server versions in the same cluster. So just wanted to do a little bit of a sidebar on that. I know the focus of this talk has been about availability groups, but we also have an FCI-like management tool that can help save you some money. And then also, if you have availability groups, you can manage them from that same UI that you saw before. So you can have your AGs, you can have your highly available instances, and manage them all from that same control plane. So it just makes life easier for those that are doing both, or one or the other. All right, so before we get into questions, I want to point out we certainly encourage trials. If anybody wants to try any of this software, certainly fill out the form at this URL, or we'll pop up another poll here where you'll have an opportunity to sign up for one. And then same goes for a demo. We just kind of barely scratched the surface here with the demo that you saw, but we'd be happy to dig deeper with you and or your teams to kind of show you a little bit more and allow you to ask questions on a one-on-one basis. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll that kind of asks about that. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, if you just want some more info, if you'd like a demo, if you're ready to embark upon a trial, or if you're not really interested quite at this time, or just an overall no, let us know. So with that, I'm going to leave the poll running. But Lauren, I'm going to hand it back to you to field some of these questions that we've got coming in.
Okay, perfect. Let's see this first question. How big is the install for DxAG?
The install. So I think the latest release is just shy of 8 megabytes. So the installation package itself is very, very tiny. And actually the process to install it is super simple. It takes, I think, 6 clicks, 7 clicks, something like that, in order to actually install it. So lightweight package and quick installation.
Okay. Does the infrastructure need to be the same on both nodes?
Absolutely not. So that is part of the beauty here. As you saw in the demo, we do not care what the infrastructure is, physical, cloud, different OS profiles, different platforms. It's completely up to you to mix and match if you desire.
Okay. Does DxAG work with only 2017 and above?
Yes, and I'll tell you the reason why that is the case. Starting in SQL Server 2017, Microsoft enabled a new value for the cluster type parameter. Okay, and so in the past, you used to be able to have a cluster type of none for just a read scale, scale out sort of deployment, or cluster type of WSFC. Okay, so those were the two cluster types that you could use. But starting in 2017, they allowed for cluster type of external. So that is what we are taking advantage of, and that wasn't released and supported by Microsoft until 2017. So yeah, it's a good question.
All right, this next question, how is DxAG licensed?
Yeah, so as you saw in the licensing slide, we are just looking at how many servers you are deploying on. And so essentially what you would want to do is just go through and add up all of your primary and secondary replicas, and that would be the server number for the licensing.
Okay. My team doesn't have time to sit down and watch an hour webinar. Are there any good summarizing documents that I can share with them?
Yeah, so there's plenty of good info on DH2I.com. Just kind of click through to the product section and you'll see information specifically related to this. But we also have, under the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel, a short flyer. So it's just a one-pager, gives a good overview if you want to hand that around your team to take a look and learn a little bit more without having to dig through the whole webinar.
Perfect. Okay. What is the trial process like?
Good question. So the trial, I'm going to close this poll because it looks like you all have pretty much already voted. So I'm going to close the poll and share a slide related to the trial process. Okay, so basically how it works is you let us know you want to do a trial and we'll get you access to our client's portal. The client's portal contains the product downloads, it contains the admin guides, it contains quick start guides, and it contains your license key. So once you've got access to that, you basically have everything that you need to get started. But of course, we are available to help you with the installation, with the configuration. If you have questions about how you want to design this or set it up, we are available to help with that. And then of course, support as you need it throughout that process. And our trial period is for 30 days. There's no cost to it, of course, and the product that you get access to is the fully featured product, other than the fact that it has a 30-day expiration.
All right. The next question says, my replicas are all in the same network. Is the tunnel feature still required for my cluster?
Very good question. So in that case, the tunnel feature would not be a requirement because you don't need to, if all your nodes can see one another on the network, then there's not necessarily a requirement for some means of tunneling between those networks. So no, and that would not be a requirement for kind of a single network cluster.
Okay. What's the performance overhead of DxAG?
The performance overhead, very, very minimal. So we can actually take a quick look here. Yeah, so what I'll say is there, it's very lightweight. It's just a handful of services that are running on each of these machines, but you're not gonna notice any sort of performance tax that this puts in place over just your normal operating system that's running.
All right. Are there different levels of this product, i.e. standard edition, enterprise edition?
Nope. No, so the clustering, is just kind of one product. But what we do have that I failed to mention before, so I'm glad you asked this question, is that the tunneling feature is an add-on feature. So, for some of those folks that only have, a cluster that's in one network, or maybe they already have VPN infrastructure set up and they, don't want to look at this, we have that base level without the tunneling feature, and that's the pricing that was shown earlier. And then if you want the tunneling feature, that's just a small additional cost on top of that to enable those tunnels.
All right. What about setting up an AG listener? They didn't see you do that.
Indeed. So great question. I didn't go through the process of setting up a listener, but you, of course, can continue to do that, using the standard kind of Microsoft process for setting up a listener, right? So we don't necessarily change that. But what we do have is, using the tunnels, you can actually create a secure tunnel to direct your remote traffic to the active node. So essentially, you go into that vhost entity, create a tunnel, and then you basically make it such that the tunnel is always will route to the active node, which in this case would be the primary replica. So yep, you can absolutely do that either with our tool to create a listener-like entity, or you can just go outside of us and create your listener like you always do within SQL Server.
All right. What does Microsoft think about all of this?
Yeah, so that's a common question. And so the answer is that this is number one, fully Microsoft certified software. So we've gone through the certification process of setting it up and going through those processes with them. And then additionally, we are listed on their SQL Server High Availability and Disaster Recover Partners page. So we're a Microsoft partner, and they have a page. If you just go out there and do a search on SQL Server High Availability and Disaster Recovery Partners, you'll hit that, and we're right near the top of the page there for partners. So they know about us. We consider ourselves partners with them, and vice versa, and it's fully certified.
Awesome. All right. Is there a way to be alerted when a failover occurs?
Absolutely. So within the tool, you can actually go in and set up global alerts policies. And so for any sort of severity of different occurrences in your cluster, you can set up email alerts that would then be shot out to your email anytime any of those things happen, filtered by severity, or maybe even filtered by different instances or different availability groups that certain individuals are responsible for. And then I'll also mention here we have a mobile app that can do some additional levels of monitoring and alerting on your mobile device.
Perfect. Can I convert an existing availability group to DxAG?
You sure can. So we have a, when you saw me adding that availability group, I was creating a new availability group, but we also have the ability to just add an availability group. So that would just add an existing availability group under our management. So if you've got some AGs out there already, yep, you can absolutely put them under our HA control.
And we got a couple more questions. Can you create a cluster from on-prem to cloud?
Absolutely, and that is precisely what you saw in the demo. Our on-prem node, Oregon machine, out to 2 different clouds. So, yep, and we make it super easy with our tunneling feature built in.
All right. Does it matter how many cores my server has for DxAG licensing?
No, in this case, a server is simply just a server as far as DxAG is concerned. So we don't look at things like core count for this particular product.
Okay, and will you guys be at PASS Summit again this year?
Yes, we will. So that's a great question. We will be there, I believe, Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, we're in booth 118 this year. So certainly come by and say hey, and would love to meet some of you all in person.
Yep, you're right, booth 118. And that looks to be about all the time that we have for today. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@dh2i.com. If we didn't get to your question, we'll reach out to you personally to answer that. We'll also be following up with you shortly after the recording of this webinar. There's also going to be a short survey after the webinar that we would appreciate you filling out. Thank you again for your participation, and we hope to see you at our other upcoming webinars.
Thanks, everyone.